For our final study then, we're going to look at Esther. As soon as she, here she is. That's not Esther, that's my friend. Here we go. One of the things you'll know about the book of Esther is that it's renowned for not mentioning the name of God anywhere. And it's a source of debate and argument throughout sort of academia, sometimes even as to whether the book of Esther should qualify to be in the canon of Scripture, given that it doesn't even mention the name of God. Now, it's true that the name of God isn't there, and perhaps we'll see, interestingly, a rather clear reason why it isn't there in just a minute. But it's not as if the book of Esther is in any way ungodly. His presence can clearly be seen. If we just put down a little sort of summary of the book of Esther as we go through, Mordecai adopts Esther, who is his niece or perhaps cousin, because she's orphaned. So there's a clear element of compassion there. And compassion, of course, is a feature that we learn from God. Mordecai helps Esther and advises her, don't let people know that you're Jewish. That will act to your disadvantage. So he helps her hide her nationality. There's an element of protection there. Mordecai shows courage when he refuses to bow down to the evil Haman, who's become the second in command in the nation. We see courage and we see empathy when Mordecai pleads for God's people, and he pleads to Esther, look, okay, you are a Jew now, whether people know it or not. You have to stand forward and help the Jewish nation because they're in threat of destruction. Perhaps most strikingly, at the end of chapter 4, we see faith in God. Esther directs that there'll be a fast held for her protection. She has to place her life on the line. We'll see how in a minute, and I'm sure you're familiar with the story. But in terms of she's being asked to put her life on the line, she decides to fast for 3 days and 3 nights beforehand. Realize that proves that she believes in a God. There is no point in fasting unless you're appealing to a higher power. There's no science or nutritional value in being hungry and saying, I've got a much better chance of survival if I'm hungry, if I go before the king hungry, than if I don't. That's obviously nonsense. So the fact that she's fasting proves that she at least believes in a God. That indicates the presence of God very strongly in the book of Esther, even if the name isn't mentioned. And we really see Esther come into her own with a courageous sacrifice, that she's prepared to go before the king and plead for her people to be saved, even though that automatically, legally earns her a death sentence by doing so. She's prepared to say, I will give up my life so that God's people can survive. And various people in Scripture, as you know, fulfill some of the roles of Jesus the Messiah. Ruth is the redeemer of her brethren. So is Jesus, of course. Deborah is a mother in Israel. That's what Jesus calls himself at one point. Jael strikes dead the serpent, which Jesus will also do. But of all the facets of the role of Messiah, surely the deepest and the biggest is that he laid down his life for God's people. And that is the role that Esther takes. Esther's reflection or prefiguring of the Lord Jesus Christ comes in that most heinous role of all. Then as the book continues, we see empathy again when Esther pleads for God's people before the king. We see courage because Esther actually has to go before the king twice because he's so easily distracted, he forgot all about what she asked for the first time when she requests Purim. That is that special dispensation for the Jews to rise up and kill their enemies that Corey read about for us. We again see protection in that Esther requests a second day of Purim when the king asks if she has any final requests. And finally, we see compassion, where Mordecai writes Purim into the legislature for the care of the poor. And in all this, we also see the salvation of the Jews is a key topic in many points of this book. So even though the name of God isn't there, without doubt, the theme of the book is how a righteous Jew look to protect God's people. So the presence of God in the book of Esther is pretty much undeniable when we look at the facets of the plot line itself. We also notice that compassion, protection, courage, empathy leads up to this central area, and reading backwards from the end of the book, compassion, protection, courage, empathy are the same features that point again to the center of the book. And with these kind of little couplets, these little pairs building together, that's what we call a chiasm. So the whole book is written as a chiasm. That word is probably not new to you, but even if it is, don't worry, you all know what a chiasm is. There's one right there, right? You look at that picture, there's 10 people you've never seen in your life before, and you know which two are more important on that day than any other. How do you know? The reason you know is because you understand how a chiasm works, even if you've never heard the word before. And the way that it works is that which is in the center is emphasized by an anti-symmetric structure from either side. So you have 4 males off to the right-hand side there, 4 groomsmen. You have 4 bridesmaids, 4 females off to the left-hand side. And the homogeneity that's created between them emphasizes the difference and therefore the seniority of the two that, at least on this day, stand in the center. You can do the same thing by playing with their dress code. So you make them look all the same and then make the star characters look different. So all the groomsmen are wearing pretty much black suits with a nice, what would you call that, royal blue tie, cornflower blue tie perhaps. And then the groom is different, slightly different. He also has a black suit, it's a different cut, but he has a bow tie, and his bow tie is white, so he stands out from his groomsmen. And the bride is even more different from her bridesmaids than the groom is from the groomsmen, suggesting that she is, in fact, the most, even of the central two, she is the most important person there, which is perfectly fair. So the bridesmaids will have cornflower blue dresses, which are cut short. She has a white dress, which goes all the way down to the ground, as you see. Everything about her presentation differs from the bridesmaid, emphasizing her presence. Sometimes they're even arranged in order of height. I think a little bit of that's happened here with the groomsmen there, so that it's pointing in crescendo to what's going on in the center, the most important people being the bride and groom, and specifically by her signature standout difference, the most important person on that day is the bride. And everybody understands this, except for the bride's mother. But that mystery is too deep for us to probe this evening. We shall leave it well alone. What's the point? The point is you get to avoid any ugly or clumsy announcements, and you still clearly present, here's the most important people. Now, this happens in literature, so we can go back now to the book of Esther and say, look, I'm looking at the same thing. It's that bridal party again. We have 4 groomsmen over here, the acts of Mordecai, and 4 bridesmaids over here. Mordecai is a little asymmetric. There's one in there at the bottom. Never mind. It is what it is. And we have 4 sort of bridesmaids over there. The point being, this is the most important part of the book, right? And that's how you say it in a very quiet but very powerful way. You don't make any clumsy announcements. But by writing the whole book as a chiasm, because normally when you tell a story, the punchline literally comes at the end. That's the most important bit of the story. But this, sometimes the most important bit of a story is in the middle. How would you emphasize that? How do you tell the reader that's how it is? You do it like that. You write it like a chiasm, and then the reader gets the sense of, just like you do from that wedding picture, there's the most important part. You can actually call it a wedding if you like, a wedding between Esther's faith in God and Esther's courageous works that extend from that faith. That's the bridal couple, Esther's faith and works, standing out in the middle of the book there. So, lovely stuff. And let's just make sure we understand Esther's name, because it's a little strange. There's a complication with it. She has a Jewish name. Her name is Hadassah, the Jewish name, and that simply means myrtle tree in Hebrew. We'll come back to that in a minute. But she's been renamed, or she's been named by her Persian captors. She's been named Esther, which in their language means star. Fair enough, reasonable name to give to a beautiful woman. There's potentially another reason why Esther's name is Esther and Mordecai's name is Mordecai, and that's because it might be that they're named after Babylonian gods. The Babylonian gods and goddesses include Ishtar and Marduk, so it makes me suspect that Esther and Mordecai have been named after Ishtar and Marduk. Why would you name them after Babylonian gods? Because you're the Persians and you've just destroyed the Babylonians. What better way? Thank you very much. That's an excellent idea. What better way to further demean the people you've just destroyed than to take their gods and name your slaves or your oppressed populace after their gods, or even name your pets after the gods of the people you've destroyed. That's the kind of thing that was going on as empire switched between empire. So I suspect that's why Esther and Mordecai have the names that they do. There's one more thing. It's not necessarily intentional, although I think it's intentional from God. Esther is also a Hebrew word. Now, the Persians don't necessarily know this or intend this, but Esther has a meaning in Hebrew, and it means hidden. So Esther's name means hidden, perhaps unintentionally by human hand. So Esther has a hidden name, and her hidden name actually means hidden. That's going to prove rather interesting. It means, take a step back, you have a book of the Bible called Hidden. So perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that within this book called Hidden, there are a few hidden things to discover. Makes sense when you consider the title. So now, the age-old question that's been argued over for centuries, why does God's name not appear in the book of Esther? Well, perhaps we have a half-decent answer right out of the title. This question, now that we know what Esther means, translates as saying, why is God's name hidden in the book called Hidden? And that question sort of answers itself, doesn't it? Because that's what God is drawing our attention to. This book is called Hidden, this woman's name is hidden, and in this book there will be hidden things. I will even hide my name, just to get your attention to that theme. For me, that seems a very elegant way to explain and to understand why the name of God is hidden in the book called Hidden. And what we will discover as we go through this evening and close out this talk is that Esther, the woman called Hidden, has a hidden agenda. And I'll present some evidence for that as we go through. Let's start the plot line as we normally do. And Esther, our leading lady, is actually kind of precursored by a leading lady of her own, Queen Vashti. And I kind of see Vashti very much as a herald, the one who comes before, just like John the Baptist came before Jesus. And to start comparing Esther to Jesus may seem a little dangerous, but let's be honest, she is the one who's prepared to lay down her life so that God's people can live. So I don't think we're going too far to see a very Jesus-like aspect in Esther, and therefore to see that she has a herald coming before her is reasonable. The king was merry with wine. He commanded to bring Queen Vashti in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. But Queen Vashti refused to come, and the king became enraged. The king is having a drunken party. It's gone on for weeks, and he wants to parade his beautiful wife before his drunken buddies, and Queen Vashti thinks that is not going to happen. And fair enough. I think that's a very honourable thing. I think Vashti is a very honourable person. And interestingly, this rattles the king sufficiently that he has to convene his council and say, what are we going to do with Queen Vashti? And you can see how fragile is the male rule here because of the advice that's given, which is probably spot on in its own way. The queen's behaviour will be made known to all women, says one of the advisers, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Let a royal order go out from the king that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes. Let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. What do you think they mean by better than she? So when the decree by the king is proclaimed, all women will give honour to their husbands, high and low alike. This is the insecurity with which Xerxes reigns, that he's concerned that if anyone finds out his wife spoke back to him, the entire order of husbands being the head of house will collapse. And he's therefore going to he deposes Vashti and exiles her and looks for someone who is better than she is. And by better, without a doubt, he means more easily controlled than Vashti was, because Vashti didn't do what she was told and threatened a great insecurity throughout the kingdom. Xerxes is fearful of losing control, which is why he wants a different queen. And of course, in Esther, he ends up with someone who's far, far worse than Vashti ever was and achieves far more than even Vashti could. Let's just introduce the main plot line. This is stuff we know well, but there's interesting jewels to pick up as we go along. King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite to be second in command in all the nation. Please notice his named ethnicity. It's highly relevant. Haman made a law that all must bow to him, but Haman became furious that Mordecai the Jew wouldn't bow down. As a consequence of that, Haman wishes to pass a law of genocide. If it pleases the king, says Haman, let a decree be issued to destroy the Jews. To which the king replies, do with the people as you please. These rules, or these laws, were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. That's relevant, I'm sure you know why. There are various laws of the Medes and Persians, and like any law, they can be repealed or changed, except whatever law was written in the king's explicit name and sealed with his ring cannot be revoked. No document written in the king's name, sealed with his ring, can be altered or revoked. This is the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be altered, that I think we know about. When Mordecai finds out about this, of course, he is bereft, and he goes to Esther to plead for the Jews to survive. But in order for her to do that, as we've said, she has to risk her life. Let's just listen to her statement on this. Esther, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. They be put to death, unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. But it's been 30 days since I was called to go to the king. So she's called to put her life on the line. And that, I think, warrants us just taking a brief aside, since this is the center of the book. We learn from the chiastic structure, we learn from the chiasm. This is the central portion of the book. Let's spend a minute here so that we understand what Esther's being called to do. That's the verse we just wrote. Any man who goes before the king without being summoned is to be put to death. That is the law. Esther then accepts the challenge that she needs to do this for the Jews to live. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. That is the demonstration of Esther's faith in God. I will plead to God for my life to be spared, even though I'm putting myself in a perilous situation. And realize, she's the queen. She lives an eminently comfortable life, and she's going to put her own life at risk for the Jews. So she's risking everything when she's in no danger herself. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And what wonderful, astonishing words. And if I perish, I perish. That's her life thrown down to protect God's people, if need be. And as the story plays out, when Xerxes saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her. Some versions suggest, I think rightly, he was astonished that she'd risked so much. He was astonished with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So God essentially gives victory. Now, that's us looking back at time at a great woman of faith. But let's make this extremely relevant to the current day. Let's consider Esther's approach to King Xerxes in the context of our approach. We too have a king to approach. And let's look at the differences between them. Esther approaches King Xerxes. The king forbids this approach by death And yet, we are invited to approach King Jesus. One of the ways we do this openly is by gathering together on Sunday mornings, but of course that's not the only mechanism by any means. Our King enables our confident approach, and yet sometimes we're still reluctant to approach him. We're still perhaps sufficiently ashamed or embarrassed of what's been happening in our lives that we shy away from this king. Esther didn't shy away, and this was a much worse king. Xerxes the king can be drunken and fly into rages. Our king is calm, sober, humble, and godlike. Esther's king was self-absorbed and manipulable. There are 12 important decisions made in the book of Esther. Go find them. This king makes only one of those 12. Everyone else around him makes all the others. The only decision Xerxes ever made was to promote Haman, which was the worst decision of all 12. So it's probably just as well he only made one out of 12, but there you go. Our king judges impartially and righteously. Esther's king punishes others when he himself is in fear, just as Vashti had to be sent into exile. And yet our king rules by justice and mercy. Esther shows huge courage to approach the throne of Xerxes. How can we be slow or afraid to approach the throne of Christ, given the comparison, or rather the complete contrast, that we have on that screen in front of us? Why would we ever be slow to approach Jesus when we have no risks, none of the risks that Esther had to take in the approach that she made? Esther's courage, I suggest to you, compels us to the throne of Christ as a tremendous example of courage that she is. Let's pick up again on the storyline. She pleads for God's people. "What is your wish, Queen Esther?" says the king. "It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." That's how astonished and impressed Xerxes was that Esther would risk her life to come before him unsummoned, that he's prepared to grant half the kingdom. And Esther, of course, is not interested in power for herself at all. As a godly woman, Esther fell at the king's feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. We know the story so well, we won't step through all the details. It climaxes with Esther saying, "For we, the Jews, have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." And Xerxes asks, he's typically completely oblivious, "Who is he and where is he who dared to do this?" "A foe and enemy," says Esther, "this wicked Haman." And that is the end of Haman. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. A cultural note, it almost certainly was an impalement pole rather than a noose. Doesn't really matter, that was the Persian way. But either way, hanged or impaled, Haman is destroyed on the very weapons that he'd created to destroy Mordecai. This is the important thing that I never picked up in Sunday school. Maybe I wasn't listening well enough, and maybe it's taught better here, I don't know. But I was taught that the lords of the Medes and Persians that cannot be changed, cannot be changed. I now realize from a simple and direct reading of the book of Esther, Esther changed them. Let's be clear. "If it pleases the king," said Esther, "let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised and wrote to destroy the Jews." But the laws that Haman wrote were sealed with the king's ring and written in his name. That was the very style of law that could not be overturned. And yet the king says, "Behold, Esther, you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked," says Xerxes, who in so doing revokes his previous law. He's not really on the ball, this lad, but that at least we learn one very important thing. Esther has overruled the law which cannot be overruled. And that's what I missed when I used to read through the book of Esther, that she actually has achieved the impossible, or what is impossible in man's world, which is fairly weak. This is an unprecedented level of power. Esther overturned Vashti, far from being better than Vashti, i.e. more manipulable than Vashti. She has turned out to be so powerful, she has overturned the law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be overturned. Now let's step forward and get into the really interesting things. Hidden. She's hidden. Her name is hidden. The book is called Hidden. And her name is also Hadassah, the myrtle tree. That's her Jewish name, right? Before the Persians named her. And there's something interesting about a myrtle tree. If you go through looking for biblical precedents, it's nice and handy because there's really only one. There's only one mention of meaning of a myrtle tree anywhere in the Bible, and it's this one. There's an angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees, or as some versions have it, even hidden among the myrtle trees. The angel of the Lord hidden among the myrtle trees says, I am exceedingly jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion. And the king allowed the Jews, back in the book of Esther, who were in every city, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, the Jews. Who organized that? Esther. She was the angel whose zeal saved the Jews. She was just like the angel hidden in the myrtle tree, and her name was Myrtle Tree all along. That isn't necessarily a new spiritual teaching, but it's beautiful to see the patterns and, may I even say, word games. I hope that's not belittling anything. The word games that God enjoys putting before us for us to discover. The angel hidden in the Hadassah tree was the one who was so zealous for Jerusalem that she ended up protecting the Jewish people and saving Zion. And as we've already suggested, Esther, whose name means hidden, has a hidden agenda. Let's see what it is, and I hope you'll find this very enjoyable. The very first king of Israel, as you know, was King Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. Consider the context of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin, to speak bluntly, was a disgrace. As you read through the book of Judges, and every man does what is right in his own eyes, and human society is falling further and further apart as you read through the book of Judges, you eventually come to that grisly chapter 19 and the rape murder of the concubine, and it's done by a Benjamite. And when Israel are inflamed at the fact that this one Benjamite man has done this thing, and they turn to the tribe of Benjamin and say, what are you going to do about this? And Benjamin effectively says, nothing, we don't really care that much. And as a result, Benjamin is seen in great disgrace, rightly so, and they're very nearly destroyed, so much so that they become the smallest tribe that's left. Now, from that disgrace, how wonderful it must be for every Benjamite that when God finally forms them into a monarchy, the very first king that steps forward is from the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul, from the house of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. So it's very much a story of redemption, of success, of just a recovery of the tribe of Benjamin. And the very, perhaps this is not often appreciated, but I often ask just to have fun, who's the last king of Israel? And Zedekiah is the name that I most commonly hear. Please realize, of course, that's wrong. The last monarch of Israel is, of course, Queen Esther, right? The last king of Israel is actually a queen. She's on a throne, and she's ruling over the children of Israel, the children of Judah, specifically. Esther is from the house of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. I knew she was from the tribe of Benjamin, but I read so carelessly, I hadn't noticed for a long time. She is directly from the same house as Saul. And we know that her ethnicity has to be kept a secret. So I think she's actually very connected to her identity as being from the house of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin. Realistically, she is a descendant of Saul's family, potentially even a direct descendant of Saul himself. And I think she identifies very clearly with King Saul. Now, the establishment of King Saul as king was great news for Benjamin. They've been restored. Suddenly they have honor, they have dignity. But there's a problem with that honor and that dignity, and that's that Saul is a total failure. I don't mean to be harsh to the man at all, God forbid, but he's an absolute failure in everything that he does. The very first time you meet Saul in the biblical record, he's searching for some missing donkeys. It's not the most dignified quest ever. Guess what? He fails. He can't find the donkeys. Not only can he not find the donkeys, someone else can and does find the donkeys. And after they've found the donkeys, Saul hasn't found the donkeys, and he doesn't even know that the donkeys have been found. So he has to be told, stop, someone's found the donkeys that you've utterly failed to find, go home. So he goes home. That's his opening story. Far more tragically, do you ever consider his closing story? On the slopes of Mount Gilboa, as he loses the house of Israel to the Philistine hordes, he falls upon his own sword. And you might think, well, that's a terrible way to die, it's suicide. But he also failed. He didn't kill himself. He failed to die. If you remember, the Amalekite comes along later to David and said, I found King Saul mortally wounded on the slopes of the mountainside, and I delivered the coup de grace, for which David kills him. So even when he fell on his sword to die, tragically he failed at that too. That really is rather sad. Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh there. But it's ultimate failure. And most importantly of all, he failed spiritually. He didn't follow what God told him to do. So Benjamin, the tribe that had been disgraced, was briefly brought back to honor. Crash. It's all in disgrace again, and there never is another Benjamite monarch. For the rest of the heritage, it's David and his family from Judah, until Esther. The entire history of the kings of Judah, David and his line, are actually bookended by Saul and by Esther, both from Benjamin. And I think the failure of King Saul is very much Esther's hidden agenda. She has a loving heart, and she wants to restore King Saul. She wants to take away the disgrace from his name, the failure from his house. Let's look at how Saul failed. Agag was the king of Amalek. We know this, and God commanded Saul to kill him. Thus says the Lord of hosts, go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Haram, in fact, is the word. You're familiar with it. But Saul and the people spared King Agag. They didn't kill Agag. We've met Agag, haven't we? Haman, son of Hammedatha, is the Agagite. So not only is Esther descended from Saul, but Haman is descended from Agag. So Esther versus Haman is Saul versus Agag 2.0. It's the rematch. And where Saul failed to kill the Agagite, Esther succeeds. They hanged Haman, the Agagite, on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. So in this action, it's not just that Esther saves the Jews, but she also reverses the failure of King Saul. She takes away that little piece of disgrace that his legacy holds, and she wipes that away. It doesn't stop there. Have a look at this. Esther's law of Purim, and that's why we had that chosen as our reading, thanks Curry, allowed the Jews to kill their enemies, and not only kill their enemies, they were allowed to take the plunder, take the spoils of those wars. But as it happens, Esther chapter 9, verse 10, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Did you notice that? Well, if you didn't, don't worry, because you'll be told again 5 verses later, but they laid no hands on the plunder. And if you didn't notice that, by verse 16, but they laid no hands on the plunder. And you're like, okay, I've got it. Stop telling me. I mean, Esther's a short book. It's not going to stay short if we say everything 3 times over. But there it is. Such a seemingly meaningless detail, and you're told it 3 times over within a space of 6 verses. You'd agree that can only be because it's important. Now, I've noticed that all my life, that's repeated 3 times. I just never knew why. But of course, with our motif in mind, that she's restoring the house of Saul, it suddenly makes much more sense, doesn't it? Because King Saul took Agag's plunder when he shouldn't. Now, Esther can't give it back. That was 500 years ago. The only thing she can do is build the opposite picture. Here is Samuel speaking. Why then, Saul, did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the plunder and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? But when Esther set up Purim, and you're allowed to take the plunder, she clearly must have sent out messages that ensured they laid no hands on the plunder, they laid no hands on the plunder, they laid no hands on the plunder. Esther has once again reversed the failure of King Saul. I think this is part of her hidden agenda. And her last request, at this point, Xerxes comes to her after the day of Purim, after the destruction of the Jews' enemies, and says, is there any last request that you have? And this has always used to surprise me, and perhaps it surprised you too. She says, yes, please, one more day of Purim. Okay, that's fair enough if they feel that there's still a significant risk out there and enough enemies out there to be worth attacking. But she also says, you'll remember, if it pleases the king, let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. That seems rather grisly, doesn't it? That seems rather vengeful. That seems rather vicious. This is supposed to be a godly woman. Why does she want to do such a vicious thing? And please understand this, because I was such a clumsy reader, I didn't understand this. Haman's 10 sons are already dead. Now, I didn't realize that. I thought they were still alive, and it's like, go out, find them, catch them, execute them. No, they've already been killed on the first day of Purim, and that's worth pointing out, and therefore perhaps it's worth poor Brother Corey having to struggle through all those names to point that out. They'd already been killed on day 1. Haman's sons are already dead. Their bodies are already in the royal morgue or wherever they've kept the bodies of important enemies. And Esther says, yeah, I want you to go out into the streets and pin these bodies up all around the city. That doesn't sound very godly. But she is a godly woman. How do we answer what she's up to? Again, it's because King Saul and his sons suffered this way. When Saul died eventually on the slopes of Gilboa, the Philistines got hold of his body and his 3 sons, and they displayed the bodies at Bethshan. We read about that in 1 Samuel 31. And you might say, okay, fine, but that's Saul and 3 sons. How then is it fair to do Haman and 10 sons if it's only Saul and 3? Maybe you don't have to have a full match, I don't know. But perhaps Esther knows her history very, very well in terms of the tribe of Benjamin, because later, when David wishes to appease the Gibeonites, he says, is there anything that I can do for you? And the Gibeonites says, yes, please. We'll have 7 of Saul's sons, please, and we'll desecrate their bodies and leave them out in the open, which they did. That's 2 Samuel 21. So in total, it's King Saul and 10 of his sons, a couple were actually grandsons, but same thing, that were displayed, that had their bodies desecrated. Esther knows this. And so she avenges the house of Saul. She says, let Haman and his 10 sons be thus displayed, as 500 years ago my ancestor King Saul and 10 of his sons were abused in that manner. And you think, well, hang on a minute, surely there's a verse about vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. I think the reason that God allows this is because Esther isn't motivated by vengeance. She's motivated by love. She's trying to clear the disgrace from the house of Saul. In all of Saul's sins, she tries to do the opposite before God. And in all of Saul's sufferings, she avenges those sufferings onto those who afflicted them, the house of Agag. There we are then. Those are the first and last kings of Israel. King Saul and Queen Esther, the Alpha and the Omega, if you will, bookending King David, the man after God's own heart, and that superb line of all those kings from the tribe of Judah. King Saul failed to kill Agag. King Saul took Agag's plunder when he shouldn't. King Saul had his body and the bodies of 10 of his sons desecrated in death. Queen Esther, the queen called Hidden, I suggest to you, had a hidden agenda in the book called Hidden. And what she did was successfully killed the Agagite that Saul had not killed. She didn't take the Agagite plunder, even though the law allowed her to. And she reversed the disgrace upon the house of Saul, that his desecrated body, by desecrating Haman's body and his 10 sons in death. Can we say then, Esther removes the disgrace from the house of Saul, and a man who's been a failure for 500 years is finally elevated to stand tall alongside the other kings of Israel. Benjamin finally has a godly monarch in Queen Esther. In fact, if she's been successful, we can argue that Benjamin now has 2 godly monarchs, Queen Esther and the one she restored, the long-dead, tragic King Saul. The last king of Israel was a queen, and when all was done, the last became first.